That's good. All right, so now let's get our presentation up and running. I don't need that one, and I don't need that one. Come on, go away, you two. Just one to feed them later. Okay. Now, slideshow. One small.
All right. How you going?
Yeah, getting there.
Did I sit there with Chairman right now, which was silent to realize that?
I don't know. I've not heard anyone. No, thank you.
Yes, I was thinking there's a bit of a problem with the someone can play, practice on and so forth as well.
Yes,
It's what about
kids and I'm up for this.
this? Hopefully there's an order as well. Yeah. Harry, Simon. Yeah, better do that for us next time. You watch it
What am I
carefully.
doing wrong?
Let's just get that in and have a look. So,
There, because I'm going to bend it down. That will almost be right. Just
It is time. Yeah.
Okay. That's all right. Cool. Hmm? Yeah, I'll read it quick. Comfy chairs up the front, Sarah. Super comfy. You might just fall asleep is the only problem. All right, we might make a start. Good evening, everybody. Really lovely to see you all on this lovely, cool night in our hall. Climate change, huh? We're going to start with a word of prayer. If you want to stay seated, that's fine. And we'll open with a word of prayer to our amazing God. Dear God in highest heaven, even the God who created all things in this world in just 6 days, who has intimate control of every system and who has predicted the future from the beginning of the world. We're grateful that you are our God, that you have called us and that you have given us an opportunity to understand you and to build a relationship with you. And we ask for your help to understand the more complex and perplexing problems that are affecting our world and to be able to help and encourage us with this knowledge. So we thank you for our time together. We pray for your help and your blessing, and we offer this prayer through Christ Jesus' name. Amen. So our speaker this evening is, I might not go into all of that, hey? I'm going to read Psalm 104 as an intro for two reasons. It is relevant. We will come back to it very briefly, and it's just beautiful. It's a beautiful psalm. Psalm 104. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, thou art very great. Thou art clothed with honor and majesty, who coverest thyself with light as with a curtain, who stretchest out the heavens like a curtain, who lays the beams of his chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariot, who walks upon the wings of the wind, who makes his angels spirits, his ministers a flaming fire, who laid the foundation of the earth that it should not be removed forever. You cover us with the deep as with the garment. Waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. They go up by the mountains. They go down by the valleys unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they turned not again to cover the earth. He sendeth the springs into the valleys which run along among the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild asses quench their thirst. By them shall the fowls of the heaven have their habitation, which sing among the branches. He watereth the hills from his chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of thy works. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle, and herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food of the earth, wine that makes glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face to shine, and bread which strengtheneth man's heart. The trees of Yahweh are full of sap, the cedars of Lebanon, which he hath planted, where the birds make their nests. As for the stork, the fir trees are her house. The high hills are the refuge for the wild goats, and the rocks for ponies. He appointed the moon for the seasons. The sun knows his going down. You make us darkness, and it is night, wherein all the beasts of the forest do creep forth. The young lions roar after their prey and seek their meat from God. The sun arises, they gather themselves together, and they lay them down in their dens. Man goes forth into his work, and to his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom hast you made them all. The earth is full of your riches. So is this great and wide sea, wherein are things innumerable, both small and great beasts. There go the ships. There is that Leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein. These wait all upon thee, that thou mayest give them their meat in due season, that thou givest them, they gather. Thou openest thy hand, and they are filled with good. Thou hidest thy, they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, and they die and return to their dust. Thou sendest forth thy spirit. They create, and thou renewest the face of the earth. The glory of the Lord shall endure forever. The Lord shall rejoice in his works. He looks on the earth, and it trembles. He touches the hills, and they smoke. I will sing unto Yahweh as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. My meditation of him shall be sweet. I will be glad in the Lord. Let the sinners be consumed out of the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless thou the Lord, O my soul. Praise ye the Lord. I think that is a beautiful psalm, and it's really very relevant to what we're talking about tonight. So our subject tonight is
God's solution to climate change. And I want to address, I guess, three things. The first is, what is climate change and is it real? And just a disclaimer at this point, if there's anyone here in the hall who, or listening in on YouTube, who has studied this subject and come to the conclusion that human-created or anthropogenic climate change is not real, or if it is real, it's entirely natural, I understand. This is a super complicated subject, and people will come to different conclusions. And climate change created by humans or not by humans, I don't know of a scripture that tells us the truth of that particular matter. And there's just so much argument out there in the scientific community about various different facets of this really complicated subject. So if that's you, don't get too stressed about the next 10 of our presentation. I think that climate change is created by people, but if you don't get too worried. After the next 10 minutes, but our subject matter will change, and I think you'll find that the conclusion by the end is something that is hopefully really useful. Anthropogenic climate change or not, it really doesn't matter, although to me it seems likely it is. So what do we mean when we talk about climate change? Well, we're talking about the changing patterns in the weather that we see in the globe around us, or at least people think that we see. And we're looking at evidence like this. So this is, you may have seen this before. This particular slide has recently been updated. And what it is showing temperature anomalies by countries throughout the years. And you can see the years picking up there at the top. And just keep an eye, don't go into a country, just have a look at the colors as they come. Just let your eye almost disfocus and just look at the colors as they flash up. Look at what's happening as we get towards 2019, where this slide finishes. Obviously, he couldn't do 2020 for me. We asked, he can't see the future. So it kind of doesn't matter what you think about the cause of this. We are seeing climate change. Here's another perspective on the same thing. So what this is showing a global map of temperature anomalies across the world. And by the way, watch the sea. Keep an eye on the sea. Don't worry so much about the land, the sea, because we'll talk about that soon. Now, incidentally, those of you who went to school a number of years ago, like I did, you will have talked about global warming. Global warming was what we talked about when I was at school. And in case some of you are wondering, why are we talking about climate change these days, and global warming was what we were talking about, the greenhouse effect and all of those sorts of things. Well, the reason for that is that even though it looks like temperatures are changing around the world and growing, it's a complex thing. And here we are, 2015 and 19, and you can see 4 regions of the world where it's actually colder, despite everything that's going on. The hottest 4 years in history, but there's sections that are colder. It's not a clear picture. And when we talk about climate change, we're actually saying, look, what we're looking at is extremes of temperature. There are increasing extremes of temperature, of weather, and of other factors that are in this. It's both hot and cold that we're seeing change. So that's why the change of language, and you will have heard it yourself. Someone will say to you, coldest winter, living record, global warming, my foot. Well, that's exactly why the language has changed, climate change, to give people a clearer understanding that what we are seeing, no matter what's caused it, is growing extremes in the weather cycle. And just let's really spot the difference. 1976, a particularly good year in almost every respect. For those of you who are wondering, that's when I was born, versus 2016. And look at the difference in global anomalies in terms of temperature. Here's another picture of exactly the same thing. Now, 2020 to date is on this chart, but what I want you to have a look at is what they've done in order to give us this hottest year on record kind of idea is they've given us a baseline. This is degrees above a baseline. And the baseline is they're saying that the temperature between 1881 and 1910 on average is taken as the baseline. How much hotter are we than that period of roughly 30 years. 30 years from 1881 to 1910, and then how much hotter. And you can see almost a march of increasing temperatures around the world. Now, some of you will have been wondering to yourselves, as we go back to this slide, or more particularly back to 1880, there's a wonderful satellite map. You know, those Victorians were super good, weren't they? We never realized they had satellites. I mean, can you picture that? Some guy with his little spectacles up there in space looking down. That's not how it happened. The way they've done this, they have done global surveys of things like sediment in the bottom of lakes, Antarctic and Arctic ice core, and a bunch of other things which have allowed them to get a pretty good idea of temperature at different points in time. It turns out that oxygen trapped in bubbles in ice cores gives us a good idea, for a variety of reasons, of the temperature in that particular year. And if you can work out what year you're looking at in terms of where you are in an ice core in Antarctica, you can work out the temperature. Now, you might think, well, that only helps us in Antarctica, but they've got a bunch of other things they use. Tree rings is another one, and a whole bunch of other stuff that they can use to kind of get an idea of global temperatures. So the first probably 60 years of this diagram is synthetic. It's not real. It's not been measured by a wonderful Victorian satellite, although I really like that picture. It's a really amusing picture to me. Some of you will have said, oh, well, look, the problem with this is there's a cherry picking, or probably no one here, but some people say, look, there's a problem. People are cherry picking data. Just doing is they're looking at the recent past, and we're seeing a bit of an upward trend at the moment, but historically it all sort of averages out. It actually doesn't. It really doesn't average out. Now, this particular chart is European in focus. It shows global temperatures for the last 2,000 years. And again, you'll be saying, what? Who was there in Roman times with a thermometer recording temperature? Tree rings is the big thing back there. And you might think, well, what scoundrel is going around cutting down 1,000-year-old trees to inspect the rings? That's not going to be very popular with the greenies. What they actually did is they excavated ancient buildings that had used large trees as part of the superstructure, both in the roof and the pillars holding them up. They dug up those trees and they looked at the tree rings. If you could date the building, date the tree. If you could date the tree, you could date the tree rings. And they did that to work out these temperatures. But the point here is you'll see, there is a variation in temperature of about a degree over a long period. But where we are now, we're heading above any norms we've ever seen before. There is variation over history. So Little Ice Age, the Little Ice Age actually sort of occurred around the time of Sir Francis Drake and a few of those sorts of events, and was significant in the events of the Spanish Armada. The Dark Age cold period had some impact on the events in the time of Justinian and beyond. And so the Dark Age was a Dark Age because it actually was really cold throughout that period. There is warm and there is cold, but we're actually heading out of that up and above. And you can see I've marked in green the peak of any of the periods of the past 2,000 years, and we're now beyond that in terms of temperature. Probably more concerning is ocean heat waves. Now, I said watch the sea in that previous one. Here's why. So what we're looking at here is a graph that shows global heat waves in the ocean, which sounds like an oxymoron, but anyone who's been up and seen coral bleaching up in Queensland will know that it's not. A heat wave can wipe out vast areas of coral. And you can see that 2016 hit this just almost unheard of thing. But that there is a trend line. There's a clear trend there in terms of the number of days that the sea is above a reasonable temperature. And there's a reason for that. You see, the sea is our planet's great heat sink. The oceans absorb about 90% of our planet's heat because water heats up easier than rock, as it turns out. And so if our planet were heating, you would expect the ocean to see the oceans warming, and we are. There are heat waves in the ocean now. Now, I'm going to put another graph over the top of that. And what this graph shows, it only goes from the 1960s, but it measures the energy stored in the ocean over again a baseline. Over a baseline of roughly 0. So what they did is they said, how much energy in terms of heat is in the whole ocean in 1960? And now let's sort of work out where we are from there. And what they've discovered or they've calculated is that there are somewhere around 17 more energies. Now, what do they mean by 17 more energies? That's a ridiculous metric. Well, they're talking about an astronomically large unit of temperature. They're using joules, which is a measure of work done effectively, or energy required to heat something up, if you like. And it's saying 17 times 10 to the power of 22 extra joules in the sea over, what, roughly 1970 something. What does that mean? I know big numbers and just throwing numbers around the place. What they're basically saying is that if you were to explode a Hiroshima bomb in the ocean every second for 30 years and convert every joule of that nuclear bomb's energy into heat, would basically graph. Just think about that. That's how much energy the ocean has absorbed. If the ocean weren't there, that heat would be on land affecting us. The ocean has been soaking up this tremendous amount of heat, and we kind of haven't been seeing it. We haven't actually been seeing the effect of this temperature rising. But it has had an effect. Again, here is a very long period, almost 2,000 years about 2,000 years of sea levels. And you can see again, large sea rises, and that's because as water heats, as we all know, it expands just by a little, 0.02% per degree is how much it expands. When you've got the amount of water we've got in the ocean, which is this enormous amount, 1 degree means 300,000 cubic kilometers of water extra. Now, it's not extra water, it's expanded by that amount. So that's why we're seeing sea levels rise. And while we're not 100% certain that it is the rise in carbon pollution that's doing it, looks pretty logical, right? There's a pretty clear correlation between rising temperatures and parts per million of carbon in the environment. Now, does anyone need me to go through carbon and environment, how it fits into the environment? All good. There you go. Here's another long graph, just to make sure we're not cherry picking data. Or we can actually go back further and show that this is not just an accident. Again, what they've done, ice cores, they've looked at parts per million of carbon dioxide in those ice cores, and they've been able to work out how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere at various different points of time. Not only that, we can work out exactly how much carbon dioxide in the environment in the atmosphere has been put into the atmosphere since 1960, because it turns out every carbon atom that's in the atmosphere since 1960 is stamped. And again, I have this really amusing picture of some poor sucker who's sitting there having to stamp every single carbon dioxide atom, molecule, that goes into the atmosphere. But what happened, obviously, is in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we started dropping nuclear bombs, doing nuclear testing, and the impact of that was it left a mark on these molecules that can be detected. And so we can actually work out, when you get a sort of sample of the atmosphere, how much of it has been put there since the 1960s. It's intriguing. Now, one of the key arguments is, well, look, probably, if you looked at this great big long cycle, what you'd actually see is there's these big variations in the sun getting warmer and colder, and that's what's done it. You know, the sun's just a bit warmer than it used to be. Maybe it's a bit nearer than it used to be. That's what's doing it. But that, unfortunately, is wrong. It's not. The yellow line shows solar irradiance. It's basically a synthetic measure of a whole bunch of different things that the sun is doing to warm up the world. But fundamentally, we're in a cooling phase at the moment. Since about 1955, with the sun, as far as we're concerned, been cooling down. But our temperature has been going up. It's not just the sun. And so, look, by and large, there's almost universal agreement that world temperatures are rising. Here are 5 different competing studies, or should I say, groups who are looking at global temperatures, and pretty wide agreement. Temperature is in general rising. Long story short, pretty much everyone agrees. As to what causes it, no end of argument. So what's the impact of that? Well, it's pretty obvious. Rising sea levels, increasing ocean acidity, as more CO2 dissolves in the ocean, increasingly violent storms, worse floods, etc., etc., etc. So, what does that look like? Well, some of you may have seen this before, some of you haven't. Years and years ago, I was on a flight back from New Zealand and I got upgraded to business class. And I was sitting in business class. She came down and she thought I was a bit young, and so she offered everyone else champagne and she offered me orange juice. Would you like an orange juice, Sonny? I was quite offended. I'll have the champagne, thank you very much. So there I am, feeling very posh and special in business class, sipping my champagne. And this movie came on. It's called The Day After Tomorrow. And what you're looking at is what they thought might happen in the future. And I sat in my business class seat, sipping my champagne and crying like a 3-year-old as I watched this and just sort of thinking, this is not far from reality. This stuff is the sort of thing that we are starting to see around the world. I mean, we have had the biggest Atlantic hurricane season ever this year. We've got the 5 hottest years in recorded history in the last 10 years. We're having increasingly bad storms, the worst fires anywhere in the world, here in Australia. Biggest area. The smoke cloud got as far as Fiji in New Zealand. And while this might be a little bit far-fetched, twists in California, in Los Angeles, maybe not. Nonetheless, I should put the lights up so I can see it better. Oh, that's right. Nonetheless, we are seeing pretty amazing changes in the weather, which make this look more like a documentary than a fantasy film. Tidal waves. There's Fukushima. This was before Fukushima. And yet, I think the people of Fukushima would feel pretty much like they'd been through this sort of thing. Stop it or keep it going? So I'm saying keep it going. All right. Terrifying. But it's the kind of, perhaps not this big yet, but it is the sort of thing we're starting to see. Storms and floods and fires and mass migration, as we're about to see in the video, mass migration as a consequence of climate change. I don't know if you've been following what's been happening, but Ethiopia is about to finish a dam that they desperately need because their people have, well, how long have they been doing 40-hour famines for Ethiopia? Since the 80s, since the 70s, right? So they built this massive dam, and Egypt is saying this is an existential threat. It wouldn't be any surprise to anyone if Egypt and Ethiopia went to war over this dam because there's not enough water to go around. So the big question is, climate change is happening, however you think it's caused, what should we do about it and how should we view this issue? Well, some of you may have heard of Greta Thunberg. Oops, hold it. I'm going to pause here because I've got no volume. So, fix that. The reason for that is YouTube is actually running in the background here. I need to get rid of that before I can show you this. There we go.
Outside the ocean. Yet your country was young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams, my hope, your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction. We hope money and benefits of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
All right, some of you may or may not have seen that particular video before. The question I've got is not whether we should jump on board with Greta Thunberg or not, but how should we view it? As believers in God, the climate situation that we're facing, and what should our perspective be? Should we be joining Greenpeace or Extinction Rebellion? So just a few thoughts on that before we move on to God's solution. Our Lord, our King said, "Are not two sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from the Father." See, God knows what's going on in nature. He cares for those sparrows, every single one of them. He tells us elsewhere, the stars themselves are named, every single last one. He says, people are of more value to God than sparrows. Again, consider the ravens. They don't sow, reap. God feeds them. God is looking out for the animals in creation. So God said after the flood this, he said, "While the earth remaineth, there will be seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, winter, day, night." They won't cease. Now, God's not here saying there won't be an environmental catastrophe, but he is saying that he will continue to regulate the seasons and the environment. That won't stop. So God's saying in those three passages, I'm looking after the animals, I'm looking after creation, I'm looking after them, but I value people more, and the things that people need, I will continue to provide. So, point number one, we should view this issue from a people perspective first. I'll come back to what I mean by that in a minute, but I'll just leave you to think about that and we'll come back to it. Point number two. Genesis 1, Adam and Eve were blessed by God, and God said to Adam and Eve, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea," etc. Adam and Eve were set to be stewards of the globe, and they had a task of replenishment, among other things. Later on, God said, "You are to be a gardener, Adam. This is what I want you to be doing." And the earth is not ours to do what we want with. It's God's and the fullness thereof. The beasts are his. So while those are not contrasting points, they're certainly counterpoints, and we want to consider them. I think both of them are useful for us in terms of our thinking. Firstly, we have a responsibility to people. That's what God has given us. We are responsible to people to preach the gospel. You and I cannot stop climate change. We cannot influence global policy, nor should we. We're told to be the small people of the world, not the big. But what we can do is help more find a relationship with God, the same God who is concerned for the survival of sparrows, is concerned for people out there. That's what he wants us to do. He wants us to focus our attentions on that. Go into all the world and preach the gospel is what Jesus said. He didn't say, go into all the world and save the world, because that's not possible. And what we're facing is a world with perplexity, situations in which there is no way out. Trust me, that would happen. He said, That's okay. That's not your problem to deal. You don't have to resolve the complexity. You preach. So it's people first focus. And interestingly enough, when you talk to people who are focused on the poor, they will say that the people who suffer most from the things that people like Greenpeace and particularly Extinction Rebellion are involved in are the poor. Because the rich can always work from home, can always find a different way to work if that particular road is blocked by Extinction Rebellion or whatever it is. But the poor, the janitors and the cleaners and the lunch ladies and those people at the bottom of society, firstly, they have to show up at work to even be paid. And if the roads are blockaded, they can't get to work. There's no work for them. And across the board, that's just one small example. What are disproportionately affected by moves towards greater climate sensitivity. This is why this is a perplexing problem. We try and fix this, and the poor are the ones who suffer the most when we reduce greenhouse gas production and the like. The poor are those who benefit the most from the production of greenhouse gases. It's why this is a perplexing problem. So, let's not get hung up on the sparrows. God will look after them. We should worry about how we help people. But still, the planet is not ours. We are stewards. We should live an environmentally responsible life. So in reality, what does that mean? I think what that means is this. I think our focus is first and foremost preaching. Don't join Greenpeace. You haven't got time for that. We should be involved, spending our time in preparing to preach and in preaching. In our own lives, though, we should not be profligate with God's environment. A simple way of saying it is Christadelphians must not litter. Okay, so what's God's solution to the problem? Well, what do you think? What are some quotes that show us that God has a solution? And just to make it really easy, it's the king, of course. Of course it is. That's God's solution to the environmental problem. But what are some quotes? So in Revelation, he does. He says he will come and destroy those who would destroy the earth. And I've always read that before they managed to. Before they managed to destroy the earth, he destroyed them. Yep, that's a great one. Uncle Kim. Excellent. So what I think that's saying, isn't it, that the world, so Uncle Kim just said, as surely as I live, all the earth should be filled with God's glory. In other words, it's going to be filled with glorious people. It will be a habitable world in the kingdom. What else? Isaiah 35, brilliant, Ben. So the deserts, those places, the Sahara was created by humanity. It's an early full climate change. We were in the wrong place. God will reverse these depredations. Yep, excellent. Anyone else? Time of refreshing quote. The time of refreshing will come from the world. And we'll look at a passage like that in a few minutes. Brilliant. Thank you, Uncle Greg. Anyone else want to say one who hasn't had a chance? Psalm 72, absolutely. A handful of grain waving even in the top of the mountains, incredible places of the world. That's how productive it will become. Brilliant. All right, so we know what the solution is, but let's think just a little bit more. God has always had complete control of the weather. Elijah prayed, and God put it into the power of his prayer to stop rain, quite a large region, for 3.5 years. And of course, God's Son has intimate control of the storm. It doesn't say, and the Lord said, peace be still, and over a 6 to 12 hour period, it gradually subsided. Does it? Absolute control of the weather. So the sea and the rain and the wind and all of those things are in obedience to God. They are under God's control. So God has got levers that we can't even contemplate at the moment from a human perspective in terms of dealing with the problems that we are addressing. But here's an interesting thought. So what this video is showing is nitrous oxide release over New York. Just look at the dates. Keep an eye on the dates because they're important. That's March 2020. What happened in March 2020? COVID. Right. So there are more than one way that God might deal with the problem of pollution and reducing it. Now, I'm not saying that God's preferred mechanism is to kill everyone with a pandemic, but nonetheless, God has got ways to slow down our pollution. What will the great battle, Armageddon, and the great earthquake that follows it do to these sorts of pollutants? I think it will reduce our production of them quite greatly. Now, here's another thought. I promised Zion's on volcanoes tonight. That's the primary reason Zion's here. Tambora, 1815, Uncle Greg's favourite year. It's in, well, I wanted to show you where it is, so let's do that. I think we've got time. Yes, we have. Let me see. All right. I need to move my mouse over to that screen. Here we are. So, got your bearings, Gosnells Wall. Looking at it from the north. So that's where we are pretty right now. I was going to zoom in and show you all in your seats, but I couldn't get the camera through the ceiling. So let's go up a little bit. Perth. Australia. Got our bearings? Good. Where's Tambora? Well, just up here in Indonesia. See that string of islands? It's believed that that string of islands they were all produced by volcanoes. In fact, if you want to sort of almost visualize an inverted donut maker, you know how donuts drop donuts into the oil and it's drop, 10 seconds later, drop. Well, it's a bit like that with upside down with sound moving over the top and little bubbles of that magma coming up, producing islands like that as the ground moves away over the top. Hard to visualize, but kind of what scientists think is happening. So let's have a look. Where's Tambora? Well, Tambora is that little lump there that you can see there. By the way, they're getting really good. Look at it. We've managed to capture to show the waves up there at the moment. So look at the car up and there. What on that? Bit of a rugged looking hillside, right up above. There you go. Now you can see kind of what's happened there. Now this happened, as we said, in 1815. Now it's a little bit hard to get an idea of the scale of this. I'm going to try and do this. Let's see. Is that the right button? Yes, the right button. Let's see. Right. So what I've just done is put a measuring tool on there that measures, right, come on, move, measures the size of that caldera. So roughly, the surface area of 37 square kilometers. So one can hypothesize for about 40 cubic kilometers of dirt went that way when Tambora went up. 40 cubic kilometers of dirt going up into the sky. That's quite a bit. So what did that do? So it was the biggest earthquake, biggest volcano in recorded history. Here's what it did in Europe. That year, well, the year after, and you can see -3 degrees across France from normal, -1.5. In fact, Napoleon's poor showing at the Battle of Waterloo is at least in part attributed to soggy conditions created by rainstorms produced by Tambora. How it produced rainstorms in France, in Belgium, is a longer story, but nonetheless, you see reductions in temperature. In fact, that reduction was global. What kind of happens is a volcano like this shoots mountains of sulfur primarily up into the atmosphere, and in fact into the stratosphere. And up in the stratosphere, the sulfur bonds with the oxygen to produce sulfur dioxide, which, as far as the atmosphere is concerned, as it aggregates, gets a bit shiny, sort of like these tiny mirrors up there in the stratosphere, and it reflects the heat. So the stratosphere, as you can see, warms up a lot as these little particles of sulfur dioxide are getting heated up and then pushing the light back out into space. 15-degree rise in the stratosphere. But hey, we don't live in the stratosphere, we live down here. Surface temperature cooling globally, this graph is -1 degree, but that impact lasted for years. In fact, most studies say that it reduced global temperatures by as much as 3 degrees. And just think about it, the IPCC is worrying about a 1.5 degree rise in temperature over the next 20 years. One volcano. And again, I promised Zion to talk about igneous. Here it is. There are two main groupings of volcanoes, and one of them produces a lot of lava. Now, lava is an interesting thing. It's very, very useful in terms of climate change, because if you've got lots of lava, and they talk about large igneous provinces, in other words, entire provinces getting covered in lava, amounts of lava. What happens is, as that solidifies, if you've just had a volcano in which there's lots of sulfur dioxide, you end up with acid rain. Not a great thing in the short term. But that acid rain falls down onto that basalt, that lava, that igneous rock. And part of the reaction is that those rocks, as they dissolve, they bond with CO2, producing carbonate salts that are then locked into the rock and locked away from the environment for a very, very long time. And in fact, when we go back into the dim dark past, we can find examples of volcanoes that produce vast amounts of basalt and drop the amount of carbon in the environment in a very short period, by a short period, 20 years or so. So what I'm trying to say here is that God, using just volcanoes as one example, and there could be hundreds that God's got, has the ability both to reduce the temperature right now and to reduce the problem, carbon, among other things, in the environment over the longer term. He has tools at his fingertips. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. Does anyone else have any comments or any thoughts that they'd like to add in? I've done most of the talking here. No. Long and boring night. My apologies. Okay, so as we wrap up, I think we can have confidence that despite what we're seeing in the world around us, God will fix it. Ben's quote. The desert will blossom as the rose. And I just really like that picture, because I don't know if you can see, but behind those roses is almost a hedge of cactuses. These roses are growing out in the desert somewhere. I thought it was a really nice picture. And referring to Uncle Greg's passage about the refreshing of the earth, the times of refreshing, this is from our reading tonight. God sends forth his spirit, the animals and all life are created, and God, not has once or can one day, continuously, God personally renews the face of the earth. So there's a task to be completed. When God made the world, he made it very good. But it was as yet unfinished. Even though it was very good, there was something to be done. the work was not finished. God said to humanity, you must be fruitful, you've got to multiply, and your job is to replenish, yes, subdue it, to put all these animals in dominion. And so the earth was to be subdued and filled, not just with animals, but with humanity. A humanity that was subdued and under the dominion of God. It's always been God's intention that we would need to replenish the earth. But our job starts and ends, really, with that dominion over the proud spirit of humanity. And what does dominion mean? Well, fundamentally, verses before in the scripture, in this chapter, man was made in the image and likeness of God. We have always been in the image of God. We look roughly like God, arms and legs, or at least the angels. But most of humanity fails to live in God's likeness, have God's thinking. And so our task starts here. It starts inside ourselves, to begin that domination of the earth and to grant God dominion first inside ourselves, and then to subdue this earth and replenish it with people who have his likeness. So God's solution to climate change today, we need to get preaching. And we'll leave it at that. Thank you, everyone. You bow your heads, we'll finish with prayer. Dear God, you are a great and amazing God. From the very beginning, you knew what the end would look like, and you set up humanity to have a clear perspective on what needed to be done. Help us to be among those who listen to your advice, who understand your purpose, and who, through your kindness, are able to contribute to what you are doing in this world. We look forward to seeing your solution to climate change in action. It promises to be exciting and perhaps troubling, but we really long to see the desert blossom as the rose, to see every man under his vine and fig tree, to see swords carved into plowshares and an agricultural lifestyle restored. Oh, bring that day and send your son back, the one who will reign from end to end, from the east to the west, from the sun's rising to its setting. We long for that time. We offer you our thanks. Pray for your blessing. Supper, if we have some tonight. We leave our lives and indeed this world where they have always been, in hand and in your care. And offer this prayer through Jesus Christ.